The eviction notice hit the kitchen table like a fist. White paper, thick envelope, the county crest stamped in black, the HOA's embossed logo like a smug eye. Mara tore it open with hands that still smelled faintly of smoke and engine oil, from the station where she had spent a decade fighting flames. She read 3 sentences, each a drop of cold water. Fill the creek within 30 days, or face fines, lien, and forced remediation. Her jaw went numb. Outside, the air smelled of wet earth and crushed pine. Somewhere down the lane, a lawnmower coughed, the sound brittle and suburban. A lazy machine trimming someone else's problem into neat stripes. "Where are you watching from?" she muttered to the canopy of her small audience on the internet. Her, neighbor's little boy, 2 bored crows, and the cameras she'd set up after the first round of harassment. Comment below, what would you do if the people in charge declared your backyard a crime scene? The first shot of the cold open is the HOA president's truck sliding into the cul-de-sac, its tailgate down like an accusation. He parks under the sycamore and steps out in a navy blazer despite the heat, the blazer smelling faintly of aftershave and old money. His name is Alden Whitcomb, 62, a face like a railroad map. Pale eyes that look at property lines the way predators look, at fences. He wears loafers in grass. He wears influence under his sleeve. His teeth flash when he smiles. Most people saw civic leadership. Mara saw a man who could deliver a sentence with a signature. His power lever was the board, the bylaws, the private covenants that read like sacraments to the homeowners who'd bought their peace with quarterly dues. Alden walked with a cane he never used, a prop of genteel fragility that softened his edges while his minutes grew teeth in closed meetings. Mara is 42, soil under her nails. A veteran firefighter who'd learned to read smoke like a language. She is also now the county archives technician, an archivist who reveres faded ink and brittle deeds, and those skills would bite back at the men who thought paper could silence people. She carries the smell of cedar from the old boxes she sorts, the metallic tang of coffee, and the ache of calluses. Her hands were steady when she thinned the stacks, and steadier yet when she turned to the creek behind her house. The creek had always been a ribbon threading the neighborhood. A shallow, singing thing that smelled of algae and spring-fed mud, that taught her children to catch tadpoles and taught her dog to leap with untrained joy. The HOA had a different name for it, an unofficial drainage way. Legal names matter. Already the neighborhood's quiet had a wrong note. Once, a pickup had dumped concrete into the creek, a neat gray wedge half-submerged near her upstream border. The sight made the skin on her neck prickle. She walked the bank and touched the concrete with an ink-stained glove. It was warm from the sun and coarse under her fingers, smelling of lime and hot rock. She heard the suburban quiet like a held breath, the distant squeal of a child on a bicycle. That same night, Alden sent a letter. Aesthetic improvements, it said, must comply with community standards. The word aesthetic in Alden's mouth meant our look. The letter smelled of stationery and threat. People love certainty. HOAs trade in it. They promise manicured lawns and uniform paint, and they barter restraint for predictability. That's the promise the people of Willow Hollow paid into, when developers sliced up the old marsh and sold tidy lots with names like Maple Knoll. They thought they were buying safety. They were buying a myth. Alden and his cohort prided themselves on enforcement. They wore bylaws like armor, turning covenants into weapons. But laws, even private ones, have teeth and gaps. Papers can be bound. People can be found. The creek, Mara thought, smelling the wet earth and the faintly sweet rot of leaves, wasn't just water running downhill. It was a living line on an old map, and old maps can outlive new arrogance. 3 streets over, an old woman named June swore she'd heard concrete being poured, the gravel crunching like bones under the trucks. The sound had been low and long, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated her thin-walled home. June's hearing was excellent, and her memory better. She smelled diesel in the morning like a weather forecast, and said it was Alden's contractor. People laughed at her at first. Old June had always liked drama. But the laughter stopped when the county inspector's van idled by, and a staccato knock came on her door. The inspector smelled of machine oil and bureaucracy. He asked questions, his voice dry as paperwork. Someone had filed a complaint. Someone had noticed water pooling in the neighboring lots. The HOA sent a corrective notice. The county sent a warning. The creek, once a small glory, was suddenly a legal problem. Mara sat with a hand on the old oak table the eviction notice had hit. Her knuckles creaked. Her mind did a salvage assessment the way she once sized a burning room. Structural integrity, exit points, people at risk. The danger here wasn't flames. It was the slow, patient corruption that melts a neighborhood into silence. Fines that compound, liens that crawl like ivy until they strangle a title, reputation-smearing letters that mean sellers won't buy. She tasted iron and thought of the ledger she kept in her head. Who owed what, who mattered, who kept quiet. She felt the rough wood under her palm, heard the hum of the fridge, and saw the photograph on the mantel, her grandmother by that creek, a fishing rod in her lap, laughing with light in her eyes. The notice was not just a legal demand, it was an insult to a lineage. "Stick with me," she said into her phone. Not really to anyone, but to the soft ghost of her firefighter training. Command presence. Steady voice. "If your HOAs ever cross the line, tell me below." Her feed blinked. Comments trickled. Names, cities, stories. People posted yes like a small army assembling. She felt something shift. Outrage has leverage if it's organized. She also felt the weight of being the spark. Sparks catch. The first real escalation arrives quietly, but with the force of inevitability. 3 nights after the notice, someone left a stack of photographs on her doorstep. The photos were glossy, deliberate. Close-ups of her backyard after the first pile of concrete, stiff edges, water stained with grout. A wide shot showing her property line marked with spray paint. An aerial taken from a drone. The creek reduced in its winding to a blunt gray scar. The pictures smelled faintly of ink and the chemicals that keep images unchanged. At the bottom, one photo was penciled a note. "We're watching." Her stomach knotted. The neighborhood's polite posture had a new menace folded into it. A surveillance that didn't need witnesses when cameras and bylaws did the talking. Mara's history played like a silent film in her head. She'd been on a crew that cut a family from a car that rolled into a creek once. She'd felt the patient, cold of river water around her boots, the gritty taste of silt on her tongue, the way the current pulled at muscle and will. She wasn't afraid of water. She was afraid of what people do with water when it becomes a tool. She dug into the county archives that week, sleeves rolled, the papers smelling of dust and glue. A comforting smell, like old books in a library. She pulled plats, easements, the developer's old drainage plan. One of those maps was printed on onion skin paper and creased where hands had folded it into a pocket. Her fingers trembled with the thrill of the hunt. Knowledge bomb 1. Drop right into the middle of a fight. Private covenants like CC&Rs. Covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Control aesthetics and common areas. But they cannot override municipal and state environmental regulations. In plain terms, an HOA can't legally tell you to destroy a waterway or block a drainage easement if state wetland protections apply. Some HOAs bank on homeowners not knowing that statutory protections supersede private covenants. The sentence landed like a new tool in Mara's mental kit bag. She could smell the paper, taste the dust, hear the rattling fan in the archive room as if punctuating the fact. This knowledge ignited a small, clean flame inside her. She started a file at home, titled Willow Hollow vs. Whitcomb. The title felt almost theatrical. The stakes felt very real. She photocopied the drainage plan, scanned the plat that showed a 40-foot easement running through her lot, and circled a faded stamp that read, County Watershed Preservation, 1987. The stamped ink bled into the page, smelling faintly of pressed flowers and bureaucracy. She took notes in a spiral. Black ink, fast handwriting. Feeling the groove of the ballpoint against paper, the tactile rhythm comforting. Each discovery edged her toward proof that the HOA's improvements had been illegal from the start. Word spreads in neighborhoods faster than county ordinances. Within a week, a small cluster of neighbors surfaced. An electrician with a limp who chewed tobacco and smelled of copper, a barista who kept bees and smelled of honey and rosemary, a teacher whose classroom posters had come home with tears and stale chalk dust. They brought their own senses. The electrician with his sharp, observant eyes, the barista with a night owl memory of who was late to meetings, the teacher with the patience of someone who knew how to marshal a group. Their stories stitched together, into a pattern. Alden had pushed the concrete project through a maintenance meeting with no prior notice, Contractors moved in at dawn, and the minutes of that meeting were suspiciously thin. The meeting minutes smelled of cheap toner and the false comfort of officialdom. They pooled what they had. June produced a faded receipt from a hardware store with a contractor's name scrawled across it. The barista found a text chain where an HOA board member joked about solving the swamp problem. The electrician, who'd been trimming wires near the creek, had footage on his dash cam. 10 seconds of a dump truck reversing, its tailgate open, a plume of dust and the dull thump of concrete hitting water. Dust in the dash cam made the digital image smell oddly like roadside air, like orphans of travel. These were small things stacked into a case. Alden responded in the predictable fashion of men used to being obeyed, with calm cruelty. He sent a letter through the HOA's lawyer, a tall, thin man with a voice like a metronome, declaring the concrete a safety measure to prevent erosion. The letter smelled of expensive paper and the confidence of cogs well greased. It accused Mara of interfering with community operations and threatened fines of $1,000 a week. He attached a photograph of a woman who'd apparently complained, cropped to look indignant, and under it the word nuisance, like a verdict. The letter was performative. It wanted compliance. Mara's reaction was a strange mix of old instincts and new tactics. She felt adrenaline like a warm current along her neck, the salt of it on her lips, and she breathed systematically, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 6, the breathing of a woman who'd diffused panic a dozen times. She called a lawyer whose number she'd kept from a firehouse friend. He smelled of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke. Even his voice was seasoned. He told her a blunt truth. HOAs can levy fines, and those fines can become liens. But a lien requires a legal process. The lawyer's words tasted of metal, factual and cold. This was the space where courage and paperwork meet. That night, Mara and her small, ragged counsel met in her living room. The light was warm and unfiltered. The couch smelled faintly of the dog and of the lemon cleaner her mother used. They spread maps across the coffee table, touching the paper and smelling old ink, and built a chain of custody with photos, receipts, and eyewitness statements. Every 3 or 4 paragraphs in her head there was a sensory rhythm. The hum of the fridge, the click of a pen, the metallic scrape of a chair leg. They mapped a plan with the precision of a fire checklist: document, preserve, challenge. They rehearsed how to tell the story in public. Clear, human, enraging. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending. Mara typed into her feed between sips of coffee. The cup warm in her hand. They staged small provocations. Someone posted drone footage to a neighborhood forum, anonymously at first, and the video made the creek look smaller in color than it had in memory, a gutter trimmed by concrete. People reacted. The HOA's board called an emergency meeting. Alden's face appeared in the community newsletter, handsome and composed, smelling of linen and intent. He wrote about community standards and protecting property values. He used words like guardianship and stewardship, the way predators call restraint protection. His rhetoric sounded like varnished justice. The board had its own legal playbook. People who read legal playbooks too often forget the human cost. Knowledge bomb 2. Drop when tension tightens. An HOA's right to enforce covenants is real, but not absolute. There are procedural protections homeowners can demand, including notice, a hearing, and an opportunity to cure alleged violations before fines escalate. Many HOAs skip steps, minutes that forget a hearing, notices that come late, or fines, applied retroactively. Keep every communication, document every interaction. This is not just strategy, it's a basic rule. Administrative due process applies even in private governance contexts, and it can be weaponized in court if the HOA fails to follow its own rules. Mara ran a finger along the edge of the minutes. She'd printed, and felt the faint roughness of toner, tasting the metallic certainty of possibility. Alden did not like getting caught. The more people read the old plat-stamped County Watershed Preservation, 1987, the more his calm veneer thinned. He started to show up at more community events, the cane more pronounced, his presence like a shadow under porch lights. He smiled while his eyes did the work of a hawk. At a block barbecue, the smell of grilled meat and sweet coleslaw filled the air. Laughter was intermittent, a fragile thing. He lingered near the lemonade stand and asked casual questions about the drainage, his voice low and conversational. Everyone noticed the bracelet on his wrist, an opal circlet that flashed like a sentinel. It was a small thing, but small things matter. Mara, meanwhile, lived two lives. At day, she catalogued fragile documents by the faint scent of paper and glue. At night, she trained neighbors in how to read a bylaw and how to look for omissions, the places where power slides through. She taught them to listen for the sound of trucks at dawn, to record, to photograph, to keep receipts. Her old firefighter metaphors returned in conversation. You don't fight a grease fire with a garden hose. You create a line, you hold it, you call for the ladder. People started to see their own stakes. They smelled the dampness of the creek and the bitter tang of injustice. The neighborhood's small, polite consensus was becoming a chorus of dissent. Then came the smear campaign, delicate and slow. Anonymous letters slid under doors, typed accusations that Mara was an agitator, exaggerating, inflaming neighbors. Someone left a voicemail on her home line, a clipped polite threat about noise and safety concerns. The voicemail vibrated in her palms. It smelled faintly of stale phone plastic. A local real estate blog ran a thinly sourced piece, suggesting that the creek issue was likely petty homeowner quarrel, with Alden quoted in language that made him sound like a man under siege. The blog smelled of trending keywords and SEO optimization. The community's gossip mill started to churn, which was exactly what the board wanted. Sow doubt, fracture solidarity, isolate the troublemaker. Mara felt the old solitary pressure. The way fires can isolate a single door while the rest of the house seems to breathe in the wrong rhythm. She pressed her hand to her chest and felt the steady thump, like a gavel. She made a list. Contacts, records, witnesses, June's memory, the electrician's dash cam, the barista's receipt, the teacher's notes. She created copies, sealed them in envelopes with tape that smelled of plastic and certainty. She took a walk to the creek at dusk. The sky was a bruised plum, the air thick with wet leaves and the metallic hint of mosquito coils. Water slid over the concrete, making a sound like a small, persistent grievance. She bent and cupped the water in her hands. It was cool and smelled like the history of the place. Alden's next move was predictably theatrical. He scheduled a board meeting in the community center and posted it with only 3 days' notice. The notice smelled of toner and hurry. He called it an emergency remediation planning session and promised the board would vote on penalties. The meeting would be a stage, and Alden planned to play the hero protecting property values. He could smell his own righteousness, and it must have tasted sweet. Mara and her allies prepared. They rehearsed statements, lined up evidence, and practiced the calm voice that takes over when a fire lieutenant speaks in a chaos-laced scene. They would demand the minutes from the contractor's hiring, the permits, the invoices, and the chain of custody for the concrete. They would ask whether the HOA had followed its own bylaws in issuing notices and holding hearings. They would ask the question that could cleave the veneer away. Who authorized the contractor and on what legal basis? As they set out their strategy, the scent of printer ink and lemon-scented hand sanitizer filled the living room, small domestic details that anchored them in reality. The day of the meeting felt like a watch. Ache in the legs, a steady hum in the ears, the taste of anxiety like old pennies. People showed up in surprising numbers. Bodies the HOA hadn't counted on. A landscaper with a sun-browned neck. A mother pushing a stroller whose baby smelled of warm milk. A high school kid with a camera who smelled like adolescence and energy. They filled the folding chairs. They smelled of coffee, sweat, and resolve. Alden arrived with a retinue. Clean shirts, soft leather shoes that had never seen a creek bank, and a manila folder that he kept close like a talisman. He smiled into the room like a man who expects applause. At the mic, he spoke about property, values, and safety. He used the word illegal only in the passive voice, as if legality were a mist that might drift in the wrong direction. The room smelled of varnish and the low static of held breath. Mara watched him, her hands cold, the wood of the chair rough under her palms. She thought of the history in her boxes and the way ink can expose a lie. The city planner who had been forced to sit in the back, brought in anonymously by someone who knew the truth, had the countenance of someone who'd rather be anywhere but watching a private entity defend what might be an illegal alteration to a public drainage. The planner's presence hummed like a relay in Mara's mind. Government has jurisdiction in some spaces, and sometimes it moves slowly, but it moves. Then, as the meeting began to heat into argument, Alden did something small and cruel. He stood and pounded his cane on the floor. The sound was sharp, a staccato punctuation. He laughed and called Mara an alarmist, and his allies nodded as if the sound were a bell of reason. The camera caught his hand, knuckles white as he gripped the cane, and showed for a beat anger that masqueraded as concern. The moment made a dozen phones tilt to capture him in motion, a thumbnail-worthy moment. The cane, the glare, the covered face of arrogance. People would share that frame later with captions. A neighbor raised her hand. June, voice a little wobbly but sharp. She told them about the sound of trucks at dawn, about concrete that didn't belong, about a man with a contract. She spoke of the smell of hot cement and the taste of worry. Her voice smelled of years and resolve. Mara watched Alden blanch, not physically, but in the way penny-pinched men do when their authority looks shaky. He offered a smile that smelled faintly of tannery and fear. The board voted, in a flurry, to table any immediate fines and to investigate further, a phrase that was a cliffhanger all by itself. The meeting adjourned with the murmur of uncertain applause and the creak of folding chairs. Outside, the night smelled of crushed grass and the faint metallic sting of something larger than any single fight. Justice, maybe, or the scent of a scandal beginning to boil. The neighbors drifted away in clusters, the hum of their conversations punctuated by low exhalations of relief and the salt of suppressed fear. Mara walked to her car and felt the cool metal under her fingertips, the chill like a promise. She realized the fight had started. It had not yet found its shape. But she had paper and witnesses and an archive that refused to lie. She had the smoke-trained instinct to hold the line. She had a community waking up. And yet the night held a final quiet swerve. When she drove home, someone had spray-painted a warning on the mailbox across from hers. Watch your water. The letters were clumsy, the paint still tacky, and the smell of aerosol cut through the warm air like a knife. It was both threat and signal, a message that someone else knew how to use public shame. Mara pressed the wheel with both hands and tasted the copper tang of adrenaline. The creek gurgled in the dark, unafraid, as if to say water remembers its path. She slept in fits and starts, dreaming in blinks, paperwork like embers, contract clauses like smoke, the taste of lemon cleaner and dust. When she woke, the first thing she did was go to the archive and pull another faded plat. On the page was the developer's inked promise. The creek was to remain unfilled, a natural drainage to be preserved. The words were thin, almost apologetic, but they were there, smelling faintly of old glue. She traced them with a finger and felt for the first time that week the steadier pulse of a possible win. The battle lines were drawn. The next scene would be about gathering evidence, deepening the fight, and exposing the rot Alden had tried to keep hidden. The fight would require courage, paper, and the stubborn persistence of people who were tired of being told their homes were theirs, except when they disagreed with the HOA. "Where are you watching from?" she asked again into the empty room. Because stories need witnesses, and because this was not just about one creek. This was about the way small authorities get used to power, the way private governance can become private tyranny, and the way ordinary people can find legal facts, knowledge bombs, and use them like flashlights in a dark room. Comment now. Has your HOA ever crossed a line? Type yes. Stick with her. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love what comes next. The cliffhanger of the night was simple but harsh. Alden's next move would not be subtle. He had been cornered, and cornered predators are dangerous. The concrete in the creek dripped slow, patient droplets, and somewhere a camera blinked on, hungry for the next reveal. The night after the community meeting, when the folding chairs had clicked back into the garage and the last of the folding tables had been folded away like a memory, Mara woke to a wet, scraping sound at the edge of her property. She padded to the back door barefoot, the cold tile against the soles of her feet, a sharp, honest sensation, and peered out. Headlights flashed across the creek, cutting the darkness into brief, obscene exposures. A truck idled where trucks shouldn't idle, engine ticking like a cooling iron. She could smell fresh concrete and diesel, the two scents laying over one another like an insult. Her phone vibrated with an incoming message from the electrician. "They're back." She grabbed her jacket, the material stiff with morning dew, and stepped outside. The grass underfoot wet and smelling of earth and peat, the air heavy with insect song and the sour tang of disturbed mud. Someone was working. In the moon's thin light, shovels slicing soil, the wet concrete forming like a gray fever into the creek. A flashlight beam caught the diamond-studded cuff of Alden's sleeve as he directed men who moved like they'd learned how to do things quietly, hands calloused, voices low. The sight of him there, his blazer swapped for a cheap windbreaker, his cane now resting unused against his truck, felt obscene. He looked like a man caught mid-assumption, the way masks slip in bright places. Mara's breath came fast, tasting faintly of the coffee she hadn't finished. She moved without thinking, footsteps soft, the scrub of jeans against wet grass, toward the workers, and for a moment time behaved like an elastic band about to snap. A man turned and saw her. He swore, a hard sound that split the night. The others scrambled, the slap of boots on gravel, the clatter of tools. The truck backed up too quickly, tires spinning, sending gravel like pebbles against the trunk of an oak. A headlamp caught Alden's face, flustered, an older man suddenly reduced by exposure. He barked orders, words that smelled of panic and stale authority. The workers fled into the dark like something embarrassed. Mara filmed them as they left, her phone's camera breathing in the scene, the concrete still wet, steam rising in. The chill, smelling of lime and newness, and the footage would be a blade later. She could hear the creek trying to keep singing under the new weight, the water making a small, tight sound. Her neighbor June came out with a flashlight, her breath visible in the cold, smelling like chamomile tea and old newspapers. And together they watched the truck disappear down the lane. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a sharp punctuation. Mara recorded, her hands steady and smelling faintly of the lemon cleaner she'd used that morning to wipe counters, and uploaded the footage to the neighborhood feed before she had it fully processed in her own mind. That footage changed everything. People who had been complacent now felt the heat of visible wrongdoing. The barista who kept bees posted it with a short caption, "Caught on camera." The post spread through local groups, picked up by a small local news site hungry for neighborhood drama. The share buttons clicked like small hammers. The HOA scrambled, issuing a bland statement about urgent preventative measures and protecting homeowners. Alden's words smelled like varnish, polished, but thin. He called it maintenance. He called it a safety improvement. To those who knew how to read maps and smell old ink, it smelled like something else. A cover. After the footage, Mara's living room became less a room and more a war room. Maps fanned across the coffee table, the smell of toner and old paper, thick in the air. The rhythm of their work fell into a mechanical cadence. Document, digitize, distribute. The electrician rewound his dashcam footage at a neighbor's house, the screen's light painting everyone's faces a blue-white. The barista brewed coffee at a pace to keep everyone awake. The smell of roasted beans filled the room like an insistence. They printed every scrap they could find. Invoices, drone stills, the county's drainage plan, the developer's old covenant stamp. Each document had its own smell: printer toner, old glue, the faint metallic tang of government seals. They stapled, labeled, and packaged a story into bundles. At the board meeting that followed, Alden came prepared with lawyers and platitudes. He moved with the assuredness of men who believe narrative is all that's needed. He produced a hastily obtained contractor's permit, one that looked new and smelled of fresh ink, but Mara, bent over the county maps earlier that day, had noticed something the permit did not want to reveal: a discrepancy in dates and signatures that suggested paperwork shuffled after the fact. She could taste the copper of discovery at the back of her tongue. Her voice when she spoke in that meeting had the clipped rhythm of a firefighter issuing commands, precise, unyielding. "Who authorized this work?" she asked, the room smelling of stale breath and the lemon cleaning wipes someone had left. On the podium, Alden smiled in a way that tried to be disarming. "We are simply protecting property lines and preventing erosion," he said, his voice smooth as lacquer and smelling faintly of aftershave. He placed the permit on the table as if that single paper could seal the night's events into legality. The board murmured assent like a flock hearted. But Mara had something else. She held out a Xerox copy of a page from the county office stamped months earlier, which showed an application for a different sort of permit, one that had been denied, because it impacted a protected drainage easement. The clerk's stamp was half-faded but legible. It smelled faintly of wet ink and authority. The room's air shifted. Someone coughed, the sound dry, like pages turning. Here, now, Mara dropped a fact that landed like a weight. Municipal permits for altering natural drainage carry a hierarchy. If a county permit was denied or conditioned, a private party cannot lawfully circumvent that by obtaining a later backdated township approval. In plain language, you can't rebury a denial with a newer piece of paper if the underlying jurisdiction retains control of brownfield or floodplain rules. If someone alters a preserved drainage feature after denial, they risk county enforcement and environmental fines. The sentence was not a flourish, it was a scalpel. The smell in the room changed. Cigarette smoke, cheap cologne, the tang of uncertainty. People leaned in. Alden's jaw tightened like a trap closing. The bluff had been called. Alden's vulnerability crackled into the light. He had been counting on silence and the inertia most homeowners gave their board. What he hadn't accounted for was the ripple of evidence. In a private conversation that someone recorded with poor audio and better instincts, a board member was overheard mentioning funding and developer reimbursements. That was small at first, a whisper like a moth beating in a shadow. But the barista found a ledger, a set of emails exchanged with a developer 2 towns over, discussing how the HOA could improve the common areas and expect a reimbursement if the cost was masked as drainage. The ledger smelled faintly of printer ink and something like the scent of old money. It suggested that Alden had a hidden lever, a financial relationship with the developer, which meant his decisions might have had profit motives beyond the platitudes of community preservation. When the ledger became a talking point, a neighbor who worked in real estate mentioned quietly that Alden's portfolio was not as sound as he let on. There were unpaid taxes on a rental, a tightening cash flow in his personal accounts. He was 62 and had leaned on influence to bolster his finances. The vulnerability was human and humiliating. A man propping himself up with the community's trust. The air around him smelled suddenly of desperation, cheap cologne and mothballs. He'd managed the HOA like a private fief. But if the fief's foundation was built on paper forgery and developer favors, it could collapse. They pushed a press release to a local paper. The headline was tidy and cruel. Neighbors accuse HOA of illegal creek filling. The paper smelled like ink and the officious flip of pages. Reporters came with microphones and polite skepticism. Mara's voice on camera was steady and smelled like lemon cleaner and resolve. The reporter asked Baldwin, the HOA attorney, slick, yes, smelling faintly of new suits, if the association had the right to do what they'd done. He answered with a practiced smile and legalese, a smokescreen that tried to cloud the simple question. But the camera catches half-truths. It cuts to images of wet concrete, to the drone footage of the truck reversing. The pings of social media began to echo through the county like a distant storm. As the public pressure rose, Alden's strategy shifted. He began issuing fines to anyone who openly opposed him, invoking arcane clauses of the CC&Rs that permitted the board to fine residents for unsightly conduct and unapproved communication. Letters arrived in the mail, their envelopes smelling of toner and a faint institutional chill. The fines were small enough to avoid immediate legal challenge but large enough to bully. $100 here, $300 there. A veteran neighbor, who lived on Social Security, received an invoice that could be crippling. The HOA's tactics had the slow cruelty of pressure pumps. They squeeze until the will gives way. Mara felt the squeeze. The fines were meant to isolate her. Financial pain has that effect. But she'd been a firefighter too long to let fear do the steering. She held an emergency fundraiser and turned the isolation into solidarity. Neighbors pitched in. Baristas' tips, electricians' cash, June's patchwork savings. The smell of coffee and counting change became the texture of a communal resistance. They deposited money into a legal defense fund with a click and a flurry of small victories, each donation smelling faintly of sweat and hope. The pressure on Alden's side intensified, and with it, his mistakes. At mid-conflict, the HOA attempted an escalatory power play. They scheduled a lien hearing and notified Mara of a hearing to impose penalties retroactively, a legal shake intended to spook and exhaust. The hearing notice smelled of bureaucracy and threat. The procedural note was thin. It listed times and dates in legalese that could lull the unaware into compliance. But the HOA had forgotten something crucial. Its own bylaws required a 30-day notice and an opportunity to be heard, with minutes kept and recorded. Mara had copies of the last 2 board meetings' minutes, and a neighbor had made a recording of Alden instructing the contractor to get it done before the meeting, words that smelled like an admission. The HOA's failure to follow its own process opened a door. Here, at roughly the midpoint of their battle when community nerves frayed and cameras poised, Mara dropped another hard truth into the courtroom of public opinion. Private associations are bound by their own bylaws. If they fail to follow their internal processes, notice, hearing, board voting quorum, an enforcement action can be voided on procedural grounds. Moreover, homeowners have remedies including injunctive relief and claims for wrongful lien if fines are levied without due process. It's not sexy law, it's slow and procedural, and it can be lethal. The sentence was a legal scalpel. People, who'd been hoping for melodrama, heard instead the sound of a loophole being sewn shut. The HOA's counsel, sensing the tide, tried to bring a heavier hand. They served a cease and desist, claiming Mara's campaign of posts and recordings constituted harassment. The letter smelled like polished lawyers and the complacency of people used to tools. It was a gambit to frighten the media and deter witnesses. They wanted the narrative to be about a rogue agitator rather than an association's misdeeds. The community had to choose what lens to view this through: safety and civility, or silence and complicity. At the same time, whispers of Alden's personal pressures grew louder. Someone found a notice of default on a property he owned across town. That document smelled of stale paper and other people's money. June, who'd been peeking into county records out of simple stubbornness, discovered Alden had been personally negotiating with a developer who stood to gain if several lots were re-engineered into buildable yards. The developer's name belonged to a company with a reputation for getting things done fast and quietly. The smell of that discovery was like diesel and a bitter aftertaste of betrayal. Alden's motives were becoming murkier than pride or control. They were economic. The most damning turn, however, arrived with an unlikely whistleblower. A contractor who'd worked briefly on the maintenance project, but quit when he realized the paperwork didn't match the reality. He smelled like sawdust and the acrid tang of a man who'd cleaned concrete off his boots and decided he wouldn't whitewash his conscience. He spoke quietly into Mara's recorder, voice thin with nerves and the weight of truth. "They told me it was approved," he said, the microphone catching the tremor. "But the county said no. They said to make it happen anyway." His words fell into the room like rain on tin. It was the kind of admission that legal teams love to slice apart. In court, it would be a seam that could unravel everything. With the contractor's testimony, recorded, the ledger, the dash cam footage, the stamped denial of permit, and the HOA's procedural failures, Mara's case felt like a ledger finally balanced. She felt the thrill of righteousness like a heat in her palms, the sensation of a firefighter finding the main line. But the HOA's counterattack would be brutal and inventive. Alden's lawyer purchased a defamation suit template, filled it with carefully selected innuendo, and threatened to sue Mara personally if she continued posting. Legal pressure wasn't just about money. It was about time and fatigue and the slow attrition of small battles. The letters arrived smelling of heavy paper and the arc of an intent to bury someone in process. Mara didn't flinch. She filed for a temporary restraining order to prevent further concrete work and asked the county to inspect the site. The county inspector came with boots smeared in mud and a clipboard that smelled of damp paper and officialness. He knelt by the creek and ran his fingers along the concrete's new edge, his brow knitting. He took samples, smelled of spent diesel and paperwork. The sample came back. The concrete had been poured across a protected easement. The county's letter smelled of ink and finality. It ordered immediate cessation of work and a restoration plan. The order would be public, and it smelled like victory with a metallic tang. Alden, cornered, tried to pivot. He called the local TV station and staged a press conference by the very creek, his voice measured and smelling faintly of antiseptic cologne. "We acted in good faith," he said, hands open like one making an invisible apology. But at his elbow, a reporter from the county paper had a stack of emails showing developer reimbursements and a conversation where Alden joked about fixing the swamp for profit. The reporter's presence felt like an inevitable mirror. Truth looks better in sunlight. The live camera caught Alden's face when the reporter asked about the developer emails. There was a micro-expression, an almost invisible tightening at the mouth, eyes flicking to the cane but not finding the need to use it. It was a thumbnail moment destined for the thumbnail. Alden's smile collapsing a fraction under the weight of exposure. People rallied. They held signs by the creek, the smell of markers and damp paper in the air. They chanted not loudly, but with conviction, "Protect our creek." The high school kid posted a montage of the night work, the contractor's admission, the ledger, and the county's denial. The montage went viral in the small circuit way local trends do. Shares multiplied, messages pinged, and legal aid groups reached out with offers. The smell of printer toner and donated coffee became the new currency of resistance. Their online numbers swelled. Strangers from other towns messaged solidarity. The scene was vivid and smelled like wet chalk and gasoline, and yet the fight was not over. Alden, desperate, reached for his last lever. A surprise motion filed in the county court requesting an emergency injunction against Mara to prevent further dissemination of defamatory material. The motion was thinly veiled as a step to protect alleged reputational harm. Its arrival smelled of fresh ink and legal malice. Media vans gathered like birds at a feeder. The community huddled, the smell of nerves like old pennies in pockets. Mara's lawyer called and warned her the injunction could be used to muzzle her voice and limit discovery. "If they get that injunction," he said, voice flat and smelling of burnt coffee, "they can slow everything down, freeze certain evidence, limit public access. We can challenge it, but emergency motions move fast." The sentence landed like a cold stone. Time had become a weapon Alden could use. His last gasp could be to bury the case for months in appeals, to bleed the community's will dry. She could taste the fear like dust in her mouth. In the courtroom, Mara stood while the judge read the temporary relief motion. The courtroom smelled like old wood and the faint sugar of court-bought coffee. Reporters rustled, pen tips tapping, as if each sound could be a tiny verdict. Alden sat with his attorney, fingers white around a manila folder. The judge's gaze flicked to the contractor's recorded statement, then to the county's denial. The room held a ripple of breath. The judge asked pointed questions about notice and process, and Alden's counsel replied with practiced evasions that smelled of well-rolled tobacco and denial. The judge paused, the scrape of a pen audible, then said he would issue a limited, "Stay on public postings, careful, narrow," and set a hearing date for 2 weeks out. The ruling was a blade of compromise. It did not silence everything, but it put a gag on certain release of evidence and gave Alden a sliver of time to regroup. The community felt the reprieve like someone handing a damp cloth to a fevered forehead, cooling but temporary. The gag order smelled of old paper and the cold breath of law. People were angry. Some wanted to burn the entire HOA board in effigy, and angry people make noise the way storms make trees sway. Comments flooded social feeds. "What would you have done in my place? Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Type yes if you think this is wrong." The calls for solidarity resonated like a bell. Activism, built like a ladder, had lost a rung, but the ladder remained. Behind the scenes, as documents were quarantined under court order and certain social posts were restricted, an anonymous source sent a thin envelope to the county prosecutor. Inside, a single greasy photocopy of a time-stamped text message, thread showing Alden coordinating with the contractor, promising compensation for discretion. The photocopy smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and the oily fingerprints of someone who'd handled it in secret. The envelope's arrival felt like someone walking into the dark with a match. The prosecutor's office smelled of old files and a new curiosity. That night, Mara sat by the creek and listened. Water moved over the new concrete, making a small, desperate sound, like someone clearing their throat after a long silence. Fireflies blinked above the bank, small green accents in the summer dark. She cupped her hands and let the creek water run through her fingers. It felt cool and real and dangerously ordinary. She mouthed a number of the contractor who'd spoken. He answered after a few rings, voice thin and shaky. "I didn't want to be part of it," he said. "They paid extra cash. They said, no questions. I couldn't keep doing it." The words tasted like old pennies in relief. As midnight pulled itself over the neighborhood, Mara uploaded the contractor's recorded admission to a secured drive and handed the keys to her lawyer. Safe, encrypted, smelling faintly of the lemon cleaner she'd used to calm her hands. She slept in scattered bursts, each dream a short, sharp film. Legal papers like embers, Alden's smile cracking, the creek restored. At dawn, the local paper ran a second story. Developer ties and secret payments, new questions for HOA president. The headline smelled of ink and the slow, inevitable fall of a man who had believed himself above scrutiny. The new attention brought more allies. A regional environmental group offered resources and an attorney specializing in easements and water rights. They smelled of rain and institutional support, heavy with the kind of authority that can tilt a small fight into something systemic. With their help, Mara planned a three-pronged strategy: preserve evidence under court order, mobilize public sentiment without violating the stay, and press the county to enforce its denial of the permit. It was a tactical approach, the kind that smelled of old leather and maps, the scent of operations that had thought through contingencies. But Alden had one more card, a card that, if played correctly, could flip public opinion and put new legal pressure on Mara. He quietly leaked a rumor to the real estate blog that the county's denial had been based on outdated maps, and that the HOA had reason to believe the drainage had been reclassified. It was a whisper smelling of spun sugar and sly intent. The blog ran with it, and some neighbors started to hesitate, unsure of what maps to trust. Alden played the game of smokes and mirrors with the ease of a practiced politician. Mara, sensing the move, called a community assembly, in small groups, because of the temporary restrictions, and explained patiently and in precise terms that smelled faintly of coffee and ink, how maps and jurisdiction worked. She used her archivist skills to walk people through stamps and dates, showing the irreversible record of the county's denial. She did not shout. She taught. She showed the procedural errors, the contractor's admission, the ledger. People nodded, and the smell of understanding was sweet and sudden. It was the scent of a community learning that power has to be provoked by knowledge. As the act closed, the county prosecutor called Mara's lawyer. They were opening an investigation into the potential misuse of public easements and suspected fraud in permitting. The prosecutor's voice on the line was authoritative, smelling of ink and the gravity of public duty. "If there's evidence of deliberate circumvention," he said, "we'll pursue it." Mara felt her chest open like a valve. The prosecutor's involvement meant the fight had moved beyond homeowners and HOA blackmail. It had touched public enforcement. The stakes were higher, and so were the risks. The cliffhanger that closed the night arrived in the form of a sealed envelope on Mara's doorstep, just as she returned from the creek, the smell of damp leaves on her boots. Inside was a single, court document, a subpoena for her to appear and produce all digital files related to the creek, with a hearing scheduled before the county judge in 4 days. The subpoena smelled of toner and finality. It demanded cooperation and threatened penalties if she failed. The neighborhood hummed like an old radio on stormy nights. Cameras were cued. The legal chessboard had slid into place. Mara stared at the envelope until the paper blurred. She could feel the heat of the fight in her palms, like the warmth of a hose just used to douse a small, stubborn fire. She set her jaw, the muscles tight but steady, and thought of July evenings and the smell of her grandmother's lawn, of the creek's patient song. She thought of the contractor's thin voice and June's steady hands. She imagined the county's maps and the old ink that never lies. She picked up her phone and typed into the neighbor feed, fingers trembling a little, the screen smelling faintly of plastic. What they did next almost made me lose everything, but it also gave me a shot at the truth. The next 60 seconds will show you exactly how a single document can destroy an entire HOA. The words were a small flare into the night. Outside, the creek moved on, impartial and stubborn. The neighborhood waited. The county printed its forms. Alden paced his house like a man counting down. Somewhere, A reporter sharpened a pencil. The fight had widened from one backyard to a matter of public will. The legal gears were turning, slow and inevitable. The cliffhanger held. Would the subpoena be a trap that froze their movement, or the lever that would pry the truth loose? The answer would come in 2 weeks, in a courtroom smelling of old wood and strong coffee, where lawyers in suits would shuffle paper and seek advantage. For now, the community held its breath, the night cradling the sound of water and the soft, persistent pulse of the people who had finally chosen not to stay quiet. The county courtroom smelled like old coffee and varnished wood, the air heavy with the fossilized patience of law. Mara sat on the edge of a hard institutional bench, the leather cold under her thighs, fingers worrying a folded photo of the creek until the paper softened under her touch. Her lawyer's suit whispered as he adjusted his tie. The sound was a small armor. Cameras were parked outside like dark birds. A murmur of human breath pooled in the corridor. The judge's bench looked like a cliff. Everyone felt like they might tumble if the wind shifted. Outside, through a high, narrow window, the sun struck bright and indifferent against the courthouse steps. The smell of street exhaust and blooming honeysuckle drifted in for a moment, and then was gone. This is where private power met public procedure. This is where a single subpoena could split an empire. Alden arrived with the stiffness of a man who had learned to walk in view, wearing the same navy blazer he'd used as a prop in a dozen board meetings. He held a manila folder like a shield, the paper edges crisp as unspent threats. His cufflinks flashed when he gestured as if summoning decorum. He kept his cane leaned against the chair as if it were a pedestal for his dignity. His smile had turned brittle. The courtroom smelled faintly of the cologne he favored, wood and toothpaste, layered over something sour, the metallic tang of money and trouble. He lifted his chin at reporters, but his eyes kept sliding to the evidence table where the contractors' recorded admissions sat like a live wire. The room was taut with the possibility of exposure. Mara's past, years spent cutting through smoke and smoke-made lies, felt useful as a pair of old gloves. She'd learned to read the architecture of danger. She read legal rooms the same way she'd read burning houses. She could feel the heat of anxiety, like the blush of embers under ash. She breathed with the slow rhythm she'd used under alarms, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. She tasted metallic resolve on her tongue. Her dog-eared archive maps lay fanned on the evidence table, the ink smelling of dust and county seals. They were not just paper. They were a chronology of promises. She thought of her grandmother fishing at the creek, the smell of summer grass and sweet tobacco. That memory was a talisman. She hoped the judge could smell it too, metaphorically, and smell justice. The courtroom filled with neighbors, the electrician with the copper scent on his fingers, the barista whose hands still smelled faintly of beans and beeswax, the teacher with chalk dust in the seams of her sleeves. June shuffled in last, smelling of chamomile and a lifetime of habit, and the room seemed to exhale. The prosecutor sat to one side, a pragmatic man who smelled like the steady iron of rule-following. He'd read the whispered envelope, the greasy photocopy someone had sent him, an anonymous act that hurtled the entire matter into public law. Alden's counsel paced like a predator unsure of the gap his teeth might find. The air hummed with cameras and the quiet scratch of pens. First thing, procedural. The judge wasn't interested in melodrama. He wanted sequence and proof. Each document, each witness, each timestamp had to be a link in a chain with no weak links. Evidence, the judge's clerk explained, is not theater. It's metallurgy. It must withstand heat, prying, and time. Mara felt her pulse articulate itself in the joints of her hands. The courtroom smelled of paper and the ghost of ink. This was the test. At the 20% mark of this act, when tension needed a sharpened fact to cut through the room's polite murmur, Mara's lawyer slid forward with the first legal knowledge bomb. He set a folder on the bench with a soft thud. The sound was a punctuation. "Your Honor," he said, voice clear as a bell. "Private covenants do not extinguish public easements. Where state or county environmental statutes protect a watercourse or drainage easement, those protections supersede any CC&Rs or board actions. Alteration of a protected easement without proper municipal approval is actionable and may carry civil and criminal penalties." The judge looked down through half-lensed eyes. The statement landed like a gavel drop deep in people's bones. Smell in the room shifted. Ink, sweat, the faint tang of adrenaline. The knowledge was simple and seismic. Private rules cannot unmake public rights. The idea echoed, and for a beat, every eye in the room turned to the glossy aerial photos of the creek. Alden's attorney countered with legal theater. A stack of permits, signatures, the smell of fresh toner and carefully prepared paperwork. He called witnesses who read scripted statements about community safety. He spoke slow, practiced lines about protecting property values and preventative maintenance. The phrase was a varnished lie, one Alden had used like a talisman, but the prosecutor produced a county clerk who testified under oath that a prior denial had been explicitly tied to a watershed protection clause. The clerk's testimony smelled of institutional steadiness and the faint must of archivists who keep the undesired truths on file. The clerk's line was small but brutal. No, the county did not authorize any alteration to that drainage in that location. This was the pivot point. Public duty met private ambition, and the gap between them yawed wide. The contractor's recorded confession played in the quiet courtroom. The poor audio, the creak in his voice, the casualness of the admission that felt like a smoking gun. The audio filled the wooden room with the sound of wet gravel, and the contractor saying, "They told me to pour it anyway, said it would be handled." The phrase made a dozen necks crane. The smell of diesel and concrete rose in the mind like memory. Alden's eyes hardened. For the first time, his effective control trembled. Outside, a camera crew filmed a thumbnail-worthy moment. Alden standing by the courthouse steps, cane in hand, a man still trying to be the story. The camera caught a flash where his face tightened, the smile gone, the man looking suddenly smaller in a public square. That frame would be a perfect still. Cane, glare, a man unmasked, ready for a headline that could use the word exposed without apology. The social feed hummed. People posted reaction emojis like flares along a coastline. The court moved through testimony like a measured tide. June, small and weathered, spoke with a voice that tasted of decades and garden soil. She described the sound, a truck at dawn, and the smell of fresh concrete in the morning air when she'd risen to water her plants. Her recollection was full of the tactile details that camera footage cannot create. She said, "It was wrong. It clung to the water like a lie." The judge listened, eyes flicking between her and the documents. The room felt simultaneously intimate and public, smelling of breath and the faint metallic scent of cameras. At the halfway mark, as the prosecutor pressed, a second knowledge bomb dropped into the courtroom's rhythm like a deliberate strike. Mara's counsel, voice low and measured, explained, "If an HOA enforces fines or liens without following its own notice and hearing process, those fines can be voided and considered wrongful. Homeowners have the right to demand procedural due process from private associations. When a board acts outside its own rules, it relinquishes the moral, and often the legal, high ground." The sentence was a scalpel applied to a soft underbelly. The courtroom inhaled. The nuances of bylaws and quorums, of minutes not taken and hearings unheld, became the legal fulcrum. That knowledge was the precise kind that dissolves authority built on omission. The smell in the room, paper, coffee, old coats, hummed with the electricity of imminent collapse. Alden's response got brittle. He tried to paint the contractor as rogue, as someone who had acted without his authorization. But witnesses, downloaded tapes, and the time-stamped texts showed otherwise. A text thread, unpleasant and oily in tenor, had Alden coordinating logistics, talking about fast work, and promising discretionary compensation. The message read aloud in court tasted like cold metal in the mouth. The judge's expression narrowed. The prosecution pointed to the ledger, to emails that implied developer reimbursements, to the suspicious timing of permits. The smell in the room shifted to the metallic tang of financial exposure. Mara felt the courtroom become smaller in a good way. The truth was compressing the space, making every word more consequential. Her own nerves thrummed like a taut rope. She remembered the creek's smell at dawn, algae and mud, and the first green note of new growth. That memory had become evidence. The prosecution laid out the environmental impact, a temporary damming of flow, sediment disruption, and potential downstream pooling that could affect neighboring properties. An environmental expert testified, voice like clear water, describing how altering a drainage easement can increase flood risk in unexpected places. "Water finds its level," he said quietly, the sentence simple and devastating. The smell of wet mud rose in the courtroom's collective imagination. Alden's vulnerability cracked wider. News reports between testimony and recess painted him not just as a bully, but as a man entangled with profit motives. The ledger showed potential reimbursement promises from the developer if the HOA's improvements could be framed as community upgrades. The prosecuting attorney, a man with the smell of resolve in his throat, argued that this was not just poor governance, but possible fraud, using HOA processes and funds, or the promise of them, to clandestinely improve a developer's holdings. The idea was incendiary. The judge's pen scratched like a scythe. Between testimonies, the neighbors whispered. The room smelled of the nervous salt of shared hope. The barista whose hands had brewed the neighborhood's late-night strategy sipped water and tasted the slight metallic edge of reality. The teacher clenched and unclenched her hands, feeling the small muscles that help shape a community learn how to fight. People texted, fingers tapping like a staccato of resolve. In small, precise ways, the community had become an organism shimmering with purpose. When the hearing resumed, the judge's questions became surgical. He asked about notice, quorum, the presence of recorded minutes, and whether the HOA had allowed hearings before imposing fines. He asked about the timeline of permits and the county's denial. His voice smelled like the steady tick of an old clock. Alden's answers, guarded, rehearsed, sounded like the patter of someone trying to cover prints in wet cement. The more he spoke, the more the evidence snagged on his tongue. At about 80% through this act, the hour when the narrative demanded a final crucial fact to blow the whole case open, Mara's attorney delivered the third knowledge bomb. He leaned forward and said, "When an HOA's board is shown to have acted in bad faith, misappropriated association funds, or engaged in fraudulent dealings, members can petition to replace the board, call a special meeting to remove officers, or, in extreme cases, seek judicial dissolution or receivership. Courts can appoint a receiver to manage association affairs or order restitution, and in some jurisdictions the state can revoke the HOA's corporate status upon sufficient proof of malfeasance." The judge's brow lifted. The courtroom smelled faintly of possibility, ink, rust, the electric scent of tides turning. The knowledge was a heavy thing. HOAs are not untouchable. There are mechanisms, procedural and judicial, to strip power from a corrupt board. The words rippled out like a shock. That truth hit Alden like cold water. The public had imagined bylaws as impenetrable walls. The law showed them as stone that can be chiseled. The thought that his board might be unseated, that the association could be placed into receivership, that restitution might be demanded. These were outcomes that made his jaw harden. He looked smaller than he had at the outset, a man whose edifice of authority had been built atop paperwork that would now be examined with forensic scrapers. The smell of his cologne no longer masked the fear. The judge paused. He ordered a temporary injunction requiring the HOA to halt any remediation or further alteration of the creek, and to preserve all digital and physical records. He required Alden to produce contracting receipts, bank statements, and internal emails for forensic review. The judge's order smelled of cedar and finality. It was a judicial boundary drawn with firm, confident lines. The press outside erupted both quietly and loudly, the kind of noise that looks like small explosions, across social feeds. The word exposed began to trend in local threads. The community felt vindicated, taste of victory bright as lemon. But legal wins are never only wins. Alden's counsel filed an emergency appeal and a defamation notice, trying to use procedural moves to shift momentum. The smell of legal gamesmanship was tobacco and hot paper. The prosecutor's office, meanwhile, announced an investigation into potential permit fraud. The world of private governance and public enforcement was colliding, and the sound of the collision made the courthouse tremor like a kettle about to whistle. People who'd leaned in now leaned harder. Those who'd stayed distant edged closer. The neighborhood's collective breath tasted like copper. In the days that followed, Alden's legal untenability widened. Developers who'd been quietly hoping for a tidy resolution, grew nervous as county inspectors walked through the neighborhood making notes and taking samples. The developers' loans began to be reviewed. Bank officers smelled paperwork with the clinical curiosity of men who fund risk. As the exposure widened, Alden's alliances thinned. Board members who had once nodded in conformity started to write letters asking for transparency, their pens scratching with the sound of survival. The smell of ink and the rustle of envelopes became the background rhythm. Mara, exhausted but steady, kept her tactical posture. She'd learned to keep calm while chaos raged. It was the marrow of her training. She sat with the county's inspectors, at the creek, boots in mud, feeling the texture of silt under her soles, the cold seep up through her socks. She pointed out places where runoff pooled and explained how the fill could reroute stormwater to a low-lying neighbor's basement. She smelled the loam and the faint chemical of disturbed concrete. Those moments were small but crucial. They were the tactile proof that legal definitions require real-world consequences, media pressure and county action combined. Alden's house, once a command center, became a site of quiet unraveling. The developers' emails, the contractors' money trails, and Alden's inconsistent signatures created a narrative too coherent to spin away. When the county moved to file a civil suit to recover remediation costs and penalize the unauthorized fill, the local headlines were brutal. HOA president's actions may cost community millions. The word scandal sat heavy and sticky in the feeds. People clicked, people shared. Justice felt public. The HOA's retreat was not immediate or clean. There were last-ditch motions, a smear campaign seeded by anonymous accounts, and an attempt to galvanize sympathetic neighbors with promises of protecting property values. But those attempts felt belated and brittle. Trust, once cracked, leaks. The neighborhood's solidarity had turned into a social membrane. It kept out falsehoods now. The smell of coffee and late-night planning sessions became the scent of resistance, a thumbnail moment that would later be clipped for social posts and shared as a turning frame. Alden stood at an emergency board meeting and watched as the same members who had once deferred to him voted to remove him from office pending the court's final actions. His cane clattered to the floor, an accidental sound that punctured the room and made every camera's autofocus flicker to his hands. The image was simple. A man losing the props he'd used to wield power. It was the kind of frame editors love. Fall from pedestals turned into a single, decisive still. The smell in that room smelled of old paper and the metallic tang of defeat. Justice advanced not with fireworks, but with a steady beat. Restitution were negotiated. A remediation plan approved, contractors hired under county supervision to responsibly remove the fill and restore the creek to its intended channel. The process was ugly and precise. Heavy hoses and silt curtains smelled like rubber and wet plastic as crews worked in the creek, their boots sucking at mud. The auditory backdrop was the click of hydraulics, the rush of displaced water finding, new paths, and the soft curse of men who learned how little time is granted to repair damage done in haste. The neighbors watched with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow, tasting both the sweetness of victory and the sour aftertaste of betrayal. The HOA's corporate status did not dissolve overnight. Laws vary, and formal dissolution requires specific findings and votes or judicial orders. But the county's civil suit and the potential for receivership were enough to remove Alden's power. A special meeting of members, called under the revised transparency rules the neighborhood now insisted upon, voted to reconstitute the board with members committed to stewardship rather than secrecy. The smell of ink and new keys, metaphorically, and actually, as new treasurers took possession of community accounts, felt like a new morning. As the restoration proceeded, the community did an unusual thing. They created a small memorial on the creek bank, a bench with a plaque that read, simply, "For the water that remembers." It smelled of varnish and new wood, and the quiet pride of people who had reclaimed something common. Mara sat on that bench one morning, sunlight slanting through the sycamores, the smell of damp leaves and brewing coffee on the air. The creek moved along its remade channel, the water clearer than it had been since the concrete had smothered its voice. Her hands were ink-smudged from signing the last of the affidavits. She tasted the metallic finish of relief. There were still consequences. Alden faced potential civil penalties, restitution demands, and reputational ruin. The contractor faced fines and contractual liability. The developers' plans for quick gains were shelved under scrutiny. But the broader victory was different and sweeter. The community had learned that small private governance structures are not immune to public law, that paperwork can be a danger to neighborhoods when wielded in bad faith, and that ordinary people, when they document, when they persist, can push back against entrenched authority. The smell of shared coffee and the rustle of community newsletters became the soundtrack of a civic education. Mara's last scene in the public arc was, not in a courtroom, but at the community picnic that celebrated the creek's reopening. Children ran shoes off and squealed as their feet met clean water. The smell of sunscreen and grilled burgers filled the air, sweet and greasy and bright. June brought a lemon cake that tasted like sunlight. People hugged, their clothes smelling like grass in summer. Mara watched from the bench by the creek, the plaque warm under her palm. She had been a spark, yes, but she felt less like a singular hero and more like someone who'd learned how to light a line properly. She posted one last message on the neighborhood feed, short, factual, and a little raw. If you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe so we can take down every corrupt HOA together. The post smelled of fresh ink and digital resolve. It was a call to arms that tasted of citrus and coffee and the quiet clarity of justice. She tagged the environmental group and the local legal aid clinic. Comments flooded in. Stories of petty tyrants, of small victories, of neighbors who found their voice. People typed yes like a chorus. The reach extended beyond Willow Hollow as other communities messaged for help and advice. The scandal had turned into a template: expose, document, demand accountability. As the sun set on Act 3, the creek's surface shimmered like a thin, honest mirror. The neighborhood's million-dollar homes no longer sat in a swamp made by arrogance. They sat beside a creek that had been repaired, a restored public good, and a reminder that shared spaces require shared stewardship. Nights came with the ordinary chorus of crickets and distant highway noise. The smell of cut grass lingered in the doorways. Alden's house, once a palace of quiet power, looked ordinary now. Paint flaking in places, a porch light left on in the night out of habit and worry. The veneer was gone. Mara's last act in the story was practical and human. She walked the restored bank with the contractor who had turned whistleblower, the man's shoulders slightly bowed but his step lighter. He smelled of sawdust and wet concrete gone from his boots. They moved slowly, listening to the creek find its voice. She said nothing grand. She handed him a cup of water and a small stack of printed materials. Information on legal protections for whistleblowers, environmental groups to contact, and community organizations that could help. She had learned in the fight that victories are fragile and require tending. The final courtroom settlement required Alden to step down, to pay restitution where proven, and to attend a public forum about governance and ethics. The developer had to fund a portion of the restoration under pressure from lenders and the county. The HOA's bylaws were rewritten to require greater transparency, independent audits, and stricter conflict of interest rules. The community established a volunteer stewardship committee and a permanent protocol for reporting irregular work. It was not perfect, nothing is, but it was durable enough to matter. Mara sat on the bench as dusk folded into night, smelling the dampness of the creek and the sweetness of nearby jasmine. She thought about the old maps in the archive, the smell of paper and ink that had helped her win. She thought about her grandmother's laughter by the water and felt something like closure, sharp but clean. She felt the weight of the fight in her shoulders like a medal. The camera that had followed the story for months clicked one last time, not to sensationalize, but to record a small reconciliation. Neighbors laying down tools, kids chasing frogs, a community learning the hard grammar of stewardship. The scene felt cinematic without needing embellishment. Your story could be next, Mara said into the small microphone of a local podcaster who'd been following their fight. Her voice was steady and slightly ironic, as if she were offering a menu of civic options rather than issuing a rallying cry. If your HOA has ever crossed a line, if you've smelled concrete in your waterway, or found a clause used as a cudgel, comment your HOA horror below. Tell us where you watched from. Hit subscribe so we can take down every corrupt HOA together. The CTA landed like a hand extended across a fence. People typed. People shared. The story spread. Justice in Willow Hollow was not a dramatic cinematic montage of confetti and perfect closure. It was paperwork signed, meetings held in daylight, fines assessed and paid, restoration crews working through rain, and new bylaws, read aloud in town hall lights. It tasted like coffee and lemon cake and the fatigue of people who had learned how to keep watch. The creek would need tending for years. Trust would need rebuilding for longer. But the greater lesson, the one that smelled faintly of ink and the sweeter scent of community, was clear. When ordinary people document, demand process, and speak together, private power can be held to account. On the last night, as a soft rain began to spill the smell of wet earth into the street, Mara stood by the creek and watched the water move on its redrawn path. She felt the cool air on her face and remembered the first time the HOA's truck rolled in like an accusation. She had wanted, at one point, just to be left alone to listen to the creek. Instead, she'd become a steward of a fight that had spilled out into the county and taught neighbors the law's practical teeth. She tapped her phone and wrote one final line. If you believe no one is above the law, like, share, and tag a friend who needs to hear this. Want to see another insane HOA takedown? Subscribe and stay loud. The words were small, direct, and full of the kind of weary hope that fuels real movements. The camera pulled back on the last frame. Mara's silhouette against the creek, the town behind her breathing the slow evening breath of a place that had learned to be brave. The bench's plaque glinted in the rain. A child's laugh threaded through the air, bright and unrepentant. The story closed not with a neat bow, but with a strong ending. A community reclaimed, a creek restored, a corrupt HOA exposed, and a line drawn, visible now, between private rule and public right. Comment now. Where are you watching from? Share this. Subscribe. The fight is never over, but neither are the people who choose to stand.